Hello and welcome. Um, my name is Dr. Olivia Carpenter, and I'm so excited and happy to welcome you to Austen and Turner Creativity and Connection, tonight's panel discussion for the York Festival of Ideas. And I am absolutely thrilled to get the chance to welcome two oh so wonderful speakers this evening. Um, I'll first introduce Lela Harris, who is an artist based in the Lake District, most known for her portraits uncovering the stories of those often overlooked and marginalized by history. Lela was recently a finalist for the Museums Association Decolonization Award 2023 for her project Black Lancastrians exhibition at Judges Lodgings Museum in Lancaster, and awarded runner-up in the V&A Illustration Awards 2022 book cover category for her work on the first illustrated edition of The Color Purple by Alice Walker, published by the Folio Society. As part of the Austen and Turner exhibition, Lela will show a selection of her exploratory collages for the commission, looking at how one of Austen's characters might have explored Harewood House, as well as highlighting the house's historic colonial connections. We're going to get a chance to chat about that in a moment. I'm very excited about that too. And I'm also thrilled to introduce Dr. Rommi Smith, an award-winning poet, playwright, performer, librettist, curator, and broadcaster who specializes in the imaginative, critical, and creative reinterpretation of archival materials. Rommi is a scholar of the Black Atlantic, whose doctoral research spans English, American, and African literature, the colonial period, the Black diaspora, and the West. Rommi is the inaugural parliamentary writer-in-residence, a three-time BBC writer-in-residence, and most recently poet-in-residence for the Wordsworth Trust. And during her role as writer-in-residence for Harewood House, specifically for the Austen and Turner exhibition, she will work with Thin Ice Press at the University of York to create prints of her work, written during the residency. Rommi will lead creative workshops and a cumulative performance of original work in collaboration with composer and musical director Christella Littress. And so we're going to get to hear about that as well. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome both of you. I'm so excited and happy to get to have a conversation with both of you about the wonderful work you've been doing, about archives, about history, about Austen and Turner, and everything in between. And to start us off, I was hoping, Rommi, you might pretty please be willing to share a poetry reading with us, if that's okay.
I'd love to do that, Olivia. Thank you so much for your very warm introduction to both Lela and I. I think what I'd like to start with is the poem Landscape 1, which is part of a series of landscape poems after Turner that I am writing in response to the house. And I think we're going to bring that up on screen so that we can see that at the same time as I read in terms of access. Landscape 1, which begins with an epigraph taken from Mansfield Park, which is also a letter, and the poem is in the form of a letter. Dear Mama, only think my cousin cannot put the map of Europe together, or my cousin cannot tell the principal rivers in Russia, or she has never heard of Asia Minor, or she does not know of the difference between watercolors and crayons. How strange. Did you ever hear anything so stupid? Jane Austen, Mansfield Park, Chapter 2. And in this poem, I imagine Jane Austen writing to JMW Turner in the late 1700s. Dear Mr. Turner, I feel it is my duty that I send my opinion under my own hand. If I am right, today the difference between crayon and watercolor is the line you draw. I must oblige. From your father's shop on Maiden Lane, above which your first cry is heard as sunrise, by your mother, haunted by the moon. The grapevine's fruit is talk, Mr. Turner. Your line runs from your father's barber's shop, past the barrow boys of Covent Garden, past butchers, blood and sawdust underfoot. You draw that line out into soft horizons, lessons in an eloquence of light, such I bargain future lives will say, you paint in color, think in light and shade. For anyone who crafts to paint a night as though its tallow moon were burning out, yet at the same time conjures tenderness, knows they paint the landscape and themselves. But as the windows of this house attest, whilst workers sing a hymn called rural bliss, the eye may be seduced by pale damask, that charming picturesque is all there is. Just as shadows loom above St. Luke's, dead silence sings. Hands fingertip the globe. Place an ear to walls. Let them explain what's within and what's outside the frame.
Wow, thank you so much, Rommi.
You're welcome.
Would you like to share another one, or shall we stop?
Well, let's come back to that, I think, because there's probably so much to unpack from what we've already heard, and I'd love to hear from Lela and yourself. So we'll come back if we have time. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for being here, first of all. So excited to think more with your art, so excited to think more with your craft, so excited to think more with how you're thinking about this history. Can I start off by asking you a little bit more about your work with the residency? What does it feel like to be working in residence at Harewood House? What kinds of things are you working on right now? How have you come to this moment? How have you come to this research?
Can I
Well,
jump in? Are you jumping in, Rommi?
go ahead. Go ahead,
I was
Lela.
like, who's going to talk first? Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Olivia, and thanks so much, Rommi, for that beautiful reading of your amazing poem. It's really, I really, every time I hear it, I learn more about that piece that you've written, which I think is brilliant. So the residency has been like a huge honor and a privilege. It's like a really exciting piece of work to work on. You know, getting to respond to two of Britain's greatest kind of innovators in terms of writing and in terms of art has been slightly overwhelming, but also very inspiring and humbling. So currently I've finished my preparatory collages, which are exploring how Miss Lamb might navigate Harewood House if she was to visit, or if I was to visit in 1817. And now I'm testing out papers, which I've been lucky enough to get from the amazing stationery cupboard at Harewood House. So really old 19th century found writing papers, which I'll be using to create the portrait of Miss Lamb, hopefully in July.
Love it.
So you heard something at the beginning through Landscape One of the ways in which I'm responding to the residency, and I'd echo, first of all, before I begin to talk about that poem and others, it's an honour and a privilege to be in residence here at Harwood. It has an extraordinary, dynamic, multifaceted history, and so you are profoundly aware of that as an artist as you come into space. I mean, it is a house that you walk through centuries. You don't just walk through doors, you walk through centuries, you walk through energies. It's a house that's very much of light and shade. You know, Ruskin wrote of, as you know, Turner's work. He paints in colour, thinks in light and shade, which is what I cite from him in the poem Landscape One. And I think that is not just symbolic of Turner's work, it's also symbolic of the house. It's of colour, but and that word is prismic, because I mean colour in terms of race, but it is also of light and shade. And the the dynamic between East and West in the house, you know, the fact that the one side of the house is where we greet the public and it is for show, and the other side is a kind of backstage. It's where the family lived historically, sleep, dream, all of those things. It makes it such a place of beauty and a place that's steeped in an evocative and rich history. And undoubtedly and indubitably, I think we're going to talk about this today. It's a house that is the consequence, it's emergent from the profits of transatlantic slavery. So what sits symbolically alongside this auspicious beauty is brutality that's underneath. It's like a kind of undertow. And certainly in the workshop that I ran this morning with some amazing writers, who some of whom were writing for the first time, that was a very profound feeling of a kind of undulation. It's like a sea itself, a contrast of things, opposites, you know, contrast that we feel as we walk through the space. So it's that in terms of the residency. It's an immense privilege. It's an extraordinary historical space, full of drama and theatre and narratives. It is like a play set in its own way, in many ways, and its beauty is archived and much commented upon, and it's in its own way also documented through things like Turner's paintings, and not just Turner, but the other artists across the years and centuries who have been associated with this house, of which I feel very proud that we are in lineage with those artists. But it's also a house where you are looking at facets of that undertow, of that history, which the house talks about very much within the Austen and Turner exhibition, but also there's a commitment by Harewood to talk about that history, to be transparent about it, to narrate it, and to not only present that in and of itself, but also to bring and dialogue with creatives and communities who are interlocutors with regard to that narrative. So, yeah.
I think I'd like to echo what you've been saying there, Rommi, as well, because it's kind of it's quite an overwhelming experience when you enter Harewood. Obviously, on the one hand, it's an amazing opportunity to immerse yourself in the history of Harewood and also the practices of Jane Austen and Turner. But I think I've really struggled with that kind of the overwhelming colonial history of Harewood in contrast to, you know, its beauty and its splendor, because I love country houses and I love wandering around them. And now as my practice has developed and I can kind of be like a critical observer, but I mean that like it in the fullest sense of the word, you know, not in an exploratory sense. And I feel like Harewood makes me feel slightly discombobulated, but in a good way, because I don't have all the answers, but it makes me ask lots of questions as to, you know, whose story are we viewing in the house, and how much of Harewood is a performance space. So I think it's been really it's pushed my practice forward a lot, I think, in terms of peeking behind the curtains and trying to tell somebody else's story within the house as well.
I think that's so interesting that you pick up on that, and just to again echo something. I mean, one of the things that I am really connecting with energy wise, I think, you know, with residencies, you have to trust. You're often working at pace and quickly, and you have deadlines that you have to meet, and there have been, so with this exhibition deadlines, for instance. And one of the things that I very much connected with early on as a first feeling was this concept and fact of Turner having been professor of perspective. That fascinated me. He was professor of perspective. Now, technically, we know that means technical drawings that are about imbuing a painting with authenticity, so it looks like it takes into account all sorts of dynamics and facets and technical aspects with regard to how you display perspective. But we know as people, perspective is emotional, it's political, its opinion, its historical perspective. And I, in the other poem that hopefully, well, I may share with you, there's a line and it makes each of us professor of perspective. And there's something about the house that turns each of us into a professor of perspective. We bring all of ourselves to the gazing and the looking at things within the space. And we feel things in response to those aspects and facets. And the windows are constructed in a way that makes you not just look outside, but inside. This morning I learned from Anne, one of the volunteers, that the paintings were placed in the library in which you see my work in the exhibition. Specifically, Turner's paintings were placed in accordance with the light. Everything was about playing to the light. That fascinates me. There's a kind of, again, going back to your earlier point, Lela, a staging of things, a theatre about things. And I don't just mean that as kind of light, but a real thought about how light engages with the content of the space, how it frames it. But I'm interested in how light and perspective shapes and frames how we see what's in the house. So that's really something ideas-wise that is sparking me.
Oh my goodness. I'm so fascinated by this. Also, I mean, I can't stop thinking about this title of professor of perspective. I mean, what a way to end up having to kind of, what a way to put it. I mean, can I kind of, in that vein, ask you a little bit about also, both to your point, Lela, as well, this question of the stories you're trying to tell and which point of view we're then looking from, kind of whose perspective, whose stories, who does the house belong to as a space if people are going to kind of step in and look at this exhibition. But I also wanted to kind of ask you about your work with archives and thinking about the history you are able to find in a space like this house or in other spaces where archives are collected, where histories are collected, because you're both thinking with archival presence. You're both thinking about what we can find when we look at our history, but I think you're both really looking for into what we don't find as well, right? You're also creating art about people we don't always hear from when we look at history and when we look at archives. And I'm so fascinated by how both of you are doing that. And wanted to ask you about that. I know that's a really broad question.
It's a big question. I suppose it's kind of like you're trying to make the invisible visible, and like celebrating and remembering. Well, my practice especially, and Rommi's very similar, is about celebrating and remembering individuals who are often overlooked in the archives. And I think a starting point for me is, what can you see in the space that you're working in? What is the obvious narrative? And then who is missing from that narrative? So it's important to know what's there and what's not there. They're of equal importance. So as part of my practice, working on loads of different projects, but say, for example, the Black Lancastrians project that I did in Lancaster, that was using archival information to celebrate and remember Black individuals who lived in Lancaster during the 18th century, which was Britain's fourth largest slave trading port. And that history had been overlooked for a long, long period of time. And it actually wasn't something that I was aware of personally. But it was about bringing those stories to life and humanizing the archives in a way, because there was only fragments that existed for these individuals. So there was burial or baptism records, or there was runaway adverts in the national newspapers of enslaved Africans who had run away from their enslavers. And I suppose it's kind of giving yourself permission to imagine or what those individuals were going through, and also remembering that those individuals were just like me or you. They were somebody's mother, somebody's brother, somebody's sister. And so it might only be a one line of a baptism date or a burial date and a first name. But if you then kind of expand the archive to look into the kind of social history of the time, what was happening overseas, what was happening locally in terms of architecture, how streets were developed, what they were named after, you can start to unpick possibly what was happening in their lives. And I think because I'm not an academic, at first I really worried that it wasn't fact when I was kind of working on these. But I then realized the importance that if we don't try to reimagine and celebrate these lives, we're doing a disservice to these individuals who showed resilience and tried to live a full life despite the constraints that they were under. So I think with the Harewood residency, I've been really intrigued as to kind of how the exhibition has been put together and what information is on show, as well as how Harewood is presenting itself to visitors as a kind of repository for this, these artifacts, but also as a conversation between Austen and Turner. And what I felt was missing in that, although it is touched upon in the exhibition, was kind of making visible the Black presence and the Black labour that went into Harewood House. It's something that has been explored within the trust and within the collections there. But when I was working on it, I kind of found information about Bertie Robinson, and he was a Black servant that worked there. And then I also had access to the fifth Countess's holiday snaps of the Caribbean, which also included, her kind of trips to the West Indies and St. Kitts and Barbados. But within those photo snaps were ex-plantation workers working on the Lascelles estates as well. And I kind of used that information to kind of create a new archive through my collages, and tried to make the invisible, i.e. the Black labour, visible in the collages, and try to explore maybe how Miss Lamb would approach the house. So that's a very long-winded trying to answer that question because it's such a big question. But yeah, just trying to unpick information from very limited sources, and that it's okay to use your inference skills and your conjecture skills and your questioning skills to try and think about individuals, and it's okay that you don't have factual information because the people in power didn't keep these records, so it's up to us to kind of imagine them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Lela, and I think really well put. And I think one of the things that I think about is this word factional. One of the books that I love the most in my academic research is An Archive of Feeling by Anne Svetkovich. Gorgeous book that looks at lesbian archives, or lesbian public archives, I think is its subtitle. And one of the things that's posited in one of the chapters in that book is at the limits of the archive, what do we do? Yeah. At the limits of the archive, what do we do? And the point is that it's important to use speculation, conjecture, to use fusings of things which are premised upon fact, in order to think about narrative, because we are talking, and particularly if we, as everybody listening will know, as you both know, when we talk about thinking about the work of another scholar I love, Jose Esteban Munoz, and looking at his work around ephemera as evidence, and making the point that, with archives that have been submerged quite literally, that are erased, actually the ephemerality is valid. It's necessary that we look at to pretty much quote him, the glimmers, residues, specks and traces of those archives, because that is what exists, that thing that, and of course Munoz was looking quite literally at the archives of Black queer men, gay men that have been bleached, quite literally erased. So that notion of that bleaching is a powerful metaphor. So residues and traces are fascinating to me, because I think about what they suggest, what they hint at. And I consider myself as a maker of work rather like a detective, rather like someone seeking clues, and I'm joining the dots, and I'm working with what Philip Bryan Harper, the scholar, calls hunch. I'm working with hunch. And I think about Lisa Knopf's work around perhapsing, that idea of we perhaps, in a context where all of the information isn't there, we think about the perhaps. And indeed, that's why one of the poems that I wrote is called Perhaps. I'm thinking about what if, It's about the speculative, but it isn't rootless. It's not based on nothing. It's based on facts, but it's a logic to address gaps and absences. And that logic is conjecture and speculation. So these things really fascinate me about working in archives generally. And I have worked, and you mentioned at the beginning, Olivia, I've worked in the parliamentary archives, particularly around 2007, to look at the passing of the Parliamentary Act to abolish the slave trade. I've worked in the BBC 3 times in its archives in various ways. I've worked, using my primary research concerns jazz and blues, women, which is part of a series called Full Moon on Progress Street, which is on BBC iPlayer. And again, with that, I'm interested in the lesser known stories, like Lela said, things that are lesser told. They're not the dominant narratives, if you like, in terms of a person's life. It's the thing that I want to sing as a scholar and as a creative, and find innovative, connecting ways to tell those stories.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating that, actually, Rommi. It's so nice to kind of hear you talk about your work and how you also engage with the archives, because you've got a lot more experience than I have. So it's really kind of inspiring to hear you talk about your work and how you do it. And I'm now acting co-chair of Lancaster Black History Group, and a friend of mine who's also co-chairing, Professor Imogen Tyler at Lancaster University. She introduced me to the work of Saidiya Hartman and her kind of assurance and celebration of fabulations. So like using your kind of creative talents to kind of merge together fact and conjecture and imagination to create starting points for individuals, which I find really exciting to do. And also, like, it's okay when there is information missing, like you were saying before, Olivia, to pull in other archives, because the archives are not actually that accessible. So I spend a lot of time as well on the New York Public Library, looking at documentary photography, and the Library of Congress, to kind of use those as visual starting points for individuals, Black individuals who are not in the archives that I want to access. And coming from a non-academic perspective, it's amazing what you can find on the internet. So it's really humbling to know, and exciting, that you don't have to be kind of within the academic world to be able to access archives. There's lots of information on hand to be able to do your own research, and to kind of when you go to an exhibition and you see something you're interested in, to do your own fabulations, to work from these starting points and do your own research as well.
I'm so glad you both brought up all of these wonderful points, but this also leads me to one of the things I most wanted to ask both of you about. In terms of the archives as a space with kind of a funky power dynamic sometimes, especially when we're thinking about 19th century people, especially when we're thinking about enslaved or formerly enslaved people, and we look at documents that are there to police their bodies, I'm thinking about ads for people who are runaways, and these documents that are trying to force them back into servitude. I think about, archives with documents around the abolition of the slave trade, and just how many of those documents are in favor of that trade, and we just learn about that violence. That power dynamic sends chills down my spine. I've always had this question about, can I fight back? Can I encounter that power dynamic and push back? And what does that look like? Can creative practice be part of that? And for that matter, who gets to access the archives at all? Must I come to this as a scholar? Can I come to this as a something else? Because scholarly practice sometimes feels like a way to push back, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it just doesn't feel good enough to talk back to this. I want a creative practice to talk back to this. I want a spiritual practice. I want some other kind of practice. to talk back to what I'm finding here, and I'm imagining that that must be part of your encounter with this kind of power dynamic, this kind of funkiness too, is it?
Yes, I mean, I want to turn to Audre Lorde, who I often turn to in different ways for different reasons, but particularly her point that poetry's function is to give name to the nameless so that it can be thought. And I think about that. I think about this function of much of life, and the history that you're speaking to, Olivia, is about, if we think about it as submerged, a history that's been subjected to all kinds of tortures, traumas, erasings, etc. An archival practice that has been afforded some and not others. Then I think we have to look to, I mean, this is why I quoted from Cvetkovich's book, An Archive of Feeling. We have to look at other forms, you know, and ways in which to tell the story based on the facts. So thinking about creativity's role as a shaping force for that, the ways in which it's a bridge to take the glimmerings, the residues of historical fact and flesh them out, and so that the full body can be seen. Because if there's anything that we know, and people listening and watching will know, is that the counter to erasure is visibility. So the whole point of this work in its own way is to make visible what is lesser known or less talked about, less centered. That's the way in which, you know, you turn the conversation to another subject, another angle, another vantage point, perhaps that isn't the dominant one. That's what this is.
Most definitely. I really totally agree with that. And I know in a lot of my work, really fortunate to work with young people quite a lot of the time. I developed a schools program to run side the Black Lancastrians project. And in that project, we teach kids how to be portrait drawing detectives. So how to use primary sources and creativity to kind of celebrate and remember an individual. So we get them to look at one of those runaway adverts that you mentioned, Olivia, before, that's on the University of Glasgow, their database of over 800 runaway adverts that appeared in the 18th and 19th century for enslaved Africans who ran away. And without that, without that repository of information, we wouldn't have had we wouldn't have known of the kind of Black community that was enslaved in the UK during that time. So thanks to their resilience and their agency, we were able to get a glimpse into what was happening because they weren't recorded in many other ways. But when I work with the young people, we'll only have a snippet of information. It's probably like less than 150 words about an individual. And one of those individuals was a boy called, referred only as Ebu Boy, in a runaway advert in Lancaster. And he ran away from the Reverend Clarkson in 1765 in Heysham. And in this advert, it lists his age, his height, his features, what clothes he was wearing, the date that he escaped. And so I teach young people, like, we only have this bit of information, but how can we imagine what this young boy could have been like? And then I get the children to line up in height so we can figure out what 5'3" looks like, so they can visualize how tall he was. And then we talk about maybe why he was only 5'3", like what impact has he had on his health, how he was brought to the UK, whether that might have impacted him physically. Then we talk about, we know what date it was when he ran away. What time of year do you think that would have been? Would it have been summer? What would the day have felt like? Would it have been warm? Would it have been cold? And then they start to imagine, would it be frightened? And then mentioned in the runaway advert is the fact that he speaks a broad Lancashire dialect, which, according to Professor Alan Rice, is the first recorded instance of a Black individual of African heritage having a regional dialect during that time. And then we get the kids to think about, what does this mean? It's a factual information that help him get caught because he was a runaway and it'd make him stand out. But does this mean then that he made friends in the village where he was kept and was able to develop a regional dialect because he spoke to individuals? Does that then mean that friends may have helped him escape? How intelligent does that mean he was to have learned several languages, and one language so well that wasn't his native tongue, that he had a regional dialect. So from these very dry facts in the archives, the young people imagined this young boy who was 16, and to them, that he's a hero, like he able to escape slavery. And we write these big storybooks, we've got dragons helping him escape everything under the sun. But it's the fact that they're using their inference skills and their empathy skills to try and imagine what his experience would be like. And at the end of that process, before I developed the portrait for this young boy, who previously was only called Ebu Boy, the children decided that was unsatisfactory, that was the way that he was referred to and unkind. And they decided, after working with a school teacher and another member of Lancaster Black History Group, that they wanted to call him Afamafuna, which is a Nigerian name, and it means my name will not be lost. And that is now how we refer to this young person. So it's just an example of how you can use the archives and creativity to tell a different story. So rather than one of confinement and capture, one of celebration and remembrance as well.
Well, that's power. Wow. I've got chills. Sorry, wow. And that's also one of the things I wanted to ask both of you about in terms of change and moving forward, and how do we do better, and what changes do we want to see on the horizon. I want to see more children access archives like this. I want children to think of this as their space and something that they can interact with and write back to, and empathize with in all sorts of ways, that next generations need to think of these spaces as their spaces, need to think of these stories as their stories. Do you agree? Or what kinds of changes would you like to see on the horizon? How would you like people to meet these stories and see this information?
Well, Layla's project example of working in schools is a really fabulous, point, about the children rethinking the name based on a tribute to a young man, young person within who perhaps they identified with, whose story they could resonate with. They saw themselves in him, and began to think about, the fact that when there are certain archives in narratives of enslavement always involve the problematic that names were forcibly changed when people were bought and sold. So of course that means, we only have to look at programs like Who Do You Think You Are to know how that has a real contemporary impact on people who are engaging with this very big culture in tracing one's family tree. What happens when the names run out? And so in that beautiful creative example that Lela gave, the children were responding to that narrative. He will have had a name. He does have a name. It's not true to say he didn't have a name. And so they were thinking culturally, anybody, I'm Nigerian, in heritage, naming systems are profoundly important. You are named in accordance with who you are in the line of children. You will be given a name that may reflect the circumstances of your birth, etc., etc. There's always each name you are given is a portal to an understanding of the context of your birth and the context of your place within the family. And so what's so beautiful about that example that Lela shared with us is that those children have thought about the circumstances of his name, the context of his name, and given him a name rather than boy, which is problematic term in and of itself, in the ways that it, as everybody will know, is often being used as a term of insult towards masculinity, Black masculinity. So I think it's heartening. It's a beautiful example of what can happen. So to answer your question about what should happen, things like that, things like where that people are invited into spaces to reconceive of archives, to understand the self as an archive. This work makes me profoundly think about how we archive ourselves as makers and creatives. I was really moved profoundly by a documentary that I saw recently about Ernest Cole, the photographer, the South African photographer, and the power of archive, the power of Black archive, the power of archiving practices to document story, so that that story has an opportunity to be held within the public imagination, not just within one's lifetime, but beyond that. And that's what that documentary makes me think of. So yes, uppermost in my mind is archiving as a radical practice, archiving as a practice of witnessing, and archiving as a personal thing. I think archives are intimate spaces of connection. I mean, when I'm handling the documents at Harewood, I think about the fingertips, the traces of other people's sweat and scent on those documents. You know, I believe that all documents are imbued with those things. They do not leave them, they haunt them. You know, much of my own work, you know, riffing off of people like Christina Sharp and Foucault, is about hauntology and archives, the hauntedness of archives. So I'm fascinated by the idea of ghosts, spectres, which leads me back to Munoz. So yeah, more of reconceiving of archives, and also feeling a personal stake in archives, that they belong to oneself rather than they belong to someone else. It's about a collective connection to those archives. And also, I think thirdly and finally, I would say one of the things that I see, and I saw that in today's workshop with the creatives that I worked with, which is the first of a series of workshops that I will be running in the house, which invite audiences to engage as creative interlocutors with the exhibition here at Harwood. It's about rethinking what audiences in relation to archives. Sometimes I think exhibitions are installed and audiences are constructed as, not that is stated, a passive recipient of the information, they're spectators to it, but actually I'm really interested in how audiences bring we are each of us a professor of perspective. We will all bring a valid viewpoint of who we are to the point of viewing something. And I'm interested in that. There were people in the workshop this morning, some of whom had never been to a workshop before, never had been into a workshop space before as adults, never felt invited in. Somebody who at the beginning of the workshop apologized for their accent. Yeah. Through to people who are seasoned workshoppers. And I think one of the great things about this residency and about the archiving practice, particularly when creativity is involved, either through residencies and through audience engagement, it's about collective. The collective. It's not just about Lela and I being in space. That's a beautiful thing. But it's also the ways in which our presence is about shaping how audiences feel that they have a right of engagement to the subject that we're writing about. It doesn't just belong to me. This story doesn't just belong to me as the writer in residence. It doesn't even just belong to the house, although it's in the house. It belongs to the people, and it's about the people being and encouraged and facilitated and supported in all of the beautiful ways that are happening across the house and its program and different projects, to feel that they are professors of perspective. They matter. Their perspective matters in regard to what is here.
Brilliantly said, Rommi. You've summed that up very, very eloquently, as always. Definitely, I think kind of that collective approach is really important within the archives. And like from a personal perspective as well, I think we should be bringing back photo albums and journaling, just because I've got no living parents now, and when they were alive, they didn't, you know, my mum didn't have a photo album of us and stuff like that. And I think when I'm accessing the archives now, these glimpses into people's lives, letters, you know, the letters that you can find in the archive at Harewood, and the photographs that you can find, and the sketches, these little things that we think are kind of you know, like beautiful historical artifacts that we should be doing now, but it's been lost in this kind of contemporary life where we are into instant gratification. And I think if we can teach kids and all across all generations actually to be history detectives and archivists and curators for their own personal well-being, I think the world will be richer for it, because You know, imagine in 100 years' time just trawling through people's Instagram accounts. It's going to be pretty boring, but it would be fabulous to be, you know, engaging in postcards or post-it notes or journals. So I think it's really important that, you know, if we start with young people, and then, you know, it also work intergenerationally as well with journaling and teaching young people how to access the archives. And they're allowed, they own the archives. You know, it's not just we're letting you in for the day. You can visit it. You own, you know, it belongs to the people of this country who reside here, who visit here. For example, I'd only used a microfiche machine like 2 years ago, and I was like, there was an assumption in the archive space that I knew how to use one and I knew how to load the film, and I was just left to my own devices. But because I don't mind asking loads of questions, I managed to get a tutorial on it. But I think there's just kind of there's a lot of assumptions about how people should and can use the archives, but I think actually it just needs to be embedded in schools, and it will then be widened up.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a sense that we are, to cite an oft used, I think, academic term, we are performing the archive. We are, the archive is a generative space. So we are creating more documents that feed into the archive of the house, and we are encouraging audiences to feed into that. So there's something cyclical about it. And I think one of the other things that I would probably also want to say is that, you know, we don't sit here alone. You know, there are a team of people who have made this exhibition possible, from Becky Burton, Rebecca Burton, who is the archivist and curator at Harewood, Diane House, the artist, through to Professor Chloe Wigston Smith, through to Professor Jenny Batchelor, Dr. Richard Johns, Jade Foster, who have been vital to what it is we see in the exhibition in the house. And we are learning from them. You know, I came to this exhibition, I am not a scholar of Austen. Like many people who will be coming to the exhibition, I am learning a lot about Austen. I knew a bit more about Turner through films, etc. But I'm learning more about them as creatives in terms of their creative practice, and I'm learning more about the context of their work, and I get to do that through the exhibition. The exhibition is multi-layered, it's dynamic. I mean, I think you don't just need one visit. It is an exhibition that will it will replay, it will repay you for there to be multiple visits to have a look at its content, because there is so much to absorb, to digest, and to take in. So yes, I think there's so many aspects to the exhibition and aspects to our residencies too.
Thank you so much. I'd like to remind the audience that we have a Q&A function. So if you have some questions as we sort of enter the last 10 minutes or so of our talk for this evening, to please go ahead and share your questions with us, because we'd love to be able to answer at least some of your audience questions tonight. But as those questions roll in, I'd like to selfishly ask one more question, if I may, a little bit about kind of craft and process, because you both are working, you're both thinking about some of these questions we've been talking about in the house. And so I was wondering a little bit about kind of, you know, what does it feel like to work in that unique light that's sort of shining in? What does it feel like to work with the weight of that history around you? Does that feel like weight? Does it feel like inspiration? Does it feel like kind of both? If we wouldn't mind speaking to that a little bit.
Oh, that is a very good question, Olivia. It's a very big question. I think I feel all those things, like a total jumble of emotions, overwhelming, inspired, but also grounded as well within my practice by being inspired to ask questions about what's there and what's missing, and also like a sense of, I don't know, like I'm from Manchester, I'm a self-taught artist, I'm from a council estate. So walking into Harewood House is quite an experience for me. So I only started practicing as an artist 6 years ago. And I got to stay over at Harewood House with Dr. Rommi Smith, which was a fantastic evening because we got to have a really good chat and hang out, but also kind of absorb the house even more. And a lot of people have asked me, like, that must have been an incredible experience, you know, what a privilege, what an honor. And it was all of those things. But also, you could feel the weight of colonialism in the house, in the grounds. The landscape has been altered significantly to show off the house by Capability Brown. You know, the every aspect of it is a performance. And the longer I stayed there, the more I was absorbing the untold stories within the house, and I felt um discomfort within me because I was also full of wonder at the same time. So I think I'm still in the processing stage, and I think all those thoughts and feelings will go into the final piece of work where I try and kind of connect with this fictional character of Jane Austen's Miss Lamb. I mean, what would it have felt like to knock on the door at Harewood House in 1817 as a mixed heritage West Indian heiress with bags of cash and no husband? You know, would they have invited you through the front door? Would you have been sent to the servants' quarters? I find it fascinating. So that's very much where I'm up to in the kind of, my head's a bit broken, but I'm really excited to find out more. So
I think just to yeah, absolutely, Lela. And I just want to also add to the list of people, by the way, before I forget, and shouldn't, Dr. Marjorie Coughlin, who was also very important to the exhibition, and is one of the curators. I would add to what Lela said. I am not the first artist there. I mean, I'm not the, you know, I sit on the shoulders of people like Dr. Geraldine Connor. Dr. Geraldine Connor, the great ethnomusicologist and composer who created Carnival Messiah, which is an extraordinary, multifaceted response, multicultural, dynamic response to Handel's Messiah. It's a reworking and reinterpretation of it. And there are also Ashley Carroll, the photographer who had created the Missing Portraits series. You see portraits of David Harewood, the actor, whose descendants were enslaved by the Lascelles family. That is on the wall. Dr. Arthur France, who is a community activist and co-founder of Leeds Carnival, beloved to Leeds, is on the wall too. So there are many artists, and that's without naming all of the visual artists whose work is already in this space. So we are not the first artists to create in response to the story and narrative of this house. We sit within a tradition, and I would say of Diane and David, the Countess and Earl of Harwood, they are artists themselves. David is a filmmaker. Diane is a multimodal artist, painter. I know her work primarily as a painter, but actually they are, as creatives, passionate about engaging other creatives to become interlocutors in terms of the house's narrative. So my response in summary is that we sit in a tradition, and there is an aim, there is an intention, which is a passionate intention to engage creatives to respond to this beautiful, complex house with all of its multifaceted narrative. And I'm very proud to be one of those who sits in that tradition.
I love thinking about this tradition as being very alive and ongoing. The art is alive, the poetry is alive. It's happening. We do have a question from the audience. That if I think we have just enough time to quickly have a quick chat about this. It's about managing kind of competition between the past and the present. So, how do you manage to switch off, and how do you separate the past from the present to stay well each day? Is it possible, as you kind of have past and present perhaps competing for your attention?
Yeah, well, I kind of feel like a time traveler, like an artistic time traveler. So when I dip into the archives, I'm very much present while I'm in there in the past. But then I like to travel back to now with the, dog walking, drawing, reading fantasy novels, something totally different in order to kind of look after my own well-being because the work is heavy at times and it's a lot to process. And I think for me, because I cannot kind of, I don't feel like I can quite cover the kind of the pain and the suffering that many individuals endure during that time. And, the circumstances, especially of Bertie Robinson, about his life there and what he must have endured. We only see one part of the story, but what would it have been like for him? And I feel like so for me personally, I just try to celebrate and remember them as individuals. Like if Bertie was, a friend's uncle, I try to connect to them in that way and celebrate them as people rather than what was done unto them. I think for me, that's the way I stay well because I don't feel like I've got the not the qualifications, but the ability to do justice to what was done to them. But I can, try and celebrate, remember for who they were as people. So that's how I do it.
Yeah, I think I think we are a continuum between past and present. I am here because of the people behind me, and there will be conceptually, biologically, people who come after me. And so I don't really see a disruption between the past and the present. When I made the point that you don't just walk through doors, you walk through centuries in a house like this at the top of the talk. I think that's here, but in the world we walk through time, and we are here as a consequence of what happened before us. So I don't necessarily know that I view the question in the same way. I respect the question very much, but I don't think it's something to shed, something that I'm in the house at the moment. I find it really interesting that um, I, I'm staying here, and I will stay here tonight, and I stayed here last night. I dream in the house, and I'm interested in that process about how dreaming in the house changes how I think about it and how I write in response to it when I'm not just visiting. I'm staying here, and yeah, I think that way about past and present is that it's all part of me and part of others who come here. There isn't one or the other, or it's both. It's a temporal continuum.
Oh, what a thought! What a space to dream in! What a
Yeah,
space to think
I
in!
think that's right, because we're creating, and at some point, we are dreaming here, as in making. Um, I love the work that you're doing, Lela, just to say, and I really I love I love that you are in a tradition, as I see it, of Black women makers of work who are creating. I'm thinking about Barbara Walker's work here as I talk, who are utilizing documents as a site of creativity, who are looking at the gaps and the things that are not said in the making of archive and the remaking of documents. I love all the work that you're doing in terms of taking papers that belong to the house and recasting those papers so that they become, and thinking about textures of papers and the collage work that is multi-layered, and in of itself, you, the maker, to me as a witness to your process, talking through it with you, and also seeing it in the exhibition, there's also your trace on those collages. There's the layers of the collage in of itself that you're bringing that include the paperwork of documents in the archive here and the stationery cupboard, but there is also the trace of you on that work. And so I'm really excited by what you're doing, and excited to see the portrait of Miss Lamb, and that you are in a tradition of makers that continue the sentence after the sentence is perceived to have finished. You are, you know, it would be wonderful to see your version of Miss Lamb, given it's, as we know, Jane Austen's unfinished novel that has become known as Sanditon.
Thank you, Rommi. That's really kind of you to say. Yeah, I feel like, you know, when you're in the last couple of weeks of the commission, your brain is like, I don't think I can do it. And then you're like, yeah, of course I can do it. It's going to be great. It's going to be fantastic. So I'm in that mojo at the minute. So your words and support mean a great deal at this point in time. So thank you so much for that. And obviously, you know, I love your work, and I find it absolutely fascinating. And in fact, you've inspired me to write. So since I was at Harewood, I now do a little bit of writing when I'm in a new space, and it helps to ground me. So if I'm drawing in a gallery, or, you know, I've sat in the Spanish library and just done a 3-minute free write. So like, my practice has been enhanced by your very presence and your talent. So thank you for that.
Well, I'm very touched, but you see, of course, Olivia, you know, I know you're asking the questions here, but the point is that this is in a tradition of Turner, right? Turner, who wrote poems as part of his painterly process. So I'm thinking that you're subliminally tuning into that, you know, way of processing the making of images.
That light bulb went off in my head too. I said, oh,
And of course, Olivia, we can't leave today without saying that you have a book that's coming out whilst we're talking about ideas. So my question to you, given what we talked about, the span of what we talked about, is how does your new book chime with the thematics of today's discussion?
Oh my goodness. Thank you. Hopefully out either later this year or early next year. I'm writing a book about representations of Black characters during this time, but I'm also often putting this kind of fictional representation in conversation with archives about actual real people. And so thinking about, okay, here's where we see enslaved people in actual history, and here's where we see enslaved people showing up in novels. Characters like Miss Lamb from Sanditon. Miss Lamb is going to be in there, of course, but I'll be thinking with an enormous variety of other texts as well. And you know, archival presence and archival absence at the same time, and archival power dynamics just have all of the kind of fireworks going off in my head the whole time both of you were talking. It was, oh yes, oh yes, oh yes. You know, because in a certain sense, Black stories are written out of literary history so much at the time. Okay, where are all of the Black characters? This was one of the questions I came to when I was a Jane Austen nut in high school. You know, teenage Olivia was looking for, okay, where are the characters like me? I'm a mixed race person. Are there going to be characters like me in a Jane Austen novel? Probably not. And then, oh, actually, not so fast. They are there. And then I had to get into my doctoral research to find out, actually, there's a ton of them. Right? It's, you know, this Miss Lamb is less known in Austen, but there's even one in Austen. And then my research took me to, you know, books that have been out of print for 200 years. And actually, in a strange sense, the archive is quite prolific with Black life and Black representation and thoughts about Black people. And so when I started to write this book about that, I went down this entire rabbit hole of what it meant for literature to try to tell these stories, what it meant for literature to try and sometimes fail to tell these stories. And I'm also thinking about Black presence and kind of powerful ways to respond. And, you know, it's I've got kind of one book thinking about, you know, the beginnings of the 19th century, but I think I've got a whole career's worth of stories to tell. So I'm just kind of trying to keep turning them out, because my goodness, every time I think I can stop, I find something else I want to talk about. I find something else, and I'm like, you know, I want more people to know that this exists. I want more people to know about this book. I want more people to know about this person. Which feels really good, even as it's also kind of quite heavy. So I appreciated how both of you were talking about, you know, the kind of weight of it, but also the inspiration of it. That it's actually, it can also be joyful work, even as it can be kind of scary work at the same time.
The book sounds great. Olivia, and I'm looking forward to it. As you're talking, it's making me think of Saidiya Hartman's book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, and the ways in which that book tells the story of Black women and does it through vignettes and through slipping into characters. And Lela, you mentioned Hartman's work around critical fabulation. That is centered as a method throughout that book. And I'm thinking, as you're talking, Olivia, as one of the great fortunes of my life is to collaborate with the wonderful composer and baritone Roderick Williams. And much of our work is about telling these stories in our collaborations. And one project that I feel very fortunate to have worked on with him for the Tower of London and for Spitalfields Music Festival, who commissioned us, is a project called the Black Songs, Black with an E on the end, telling where I step into as a poet, they're formal poems, but I write in the imagined voices of Luce Bainham, who was a brothel owner who was rumoured to be one of Shakespeare's lovers, and there's conjecture about whether she was one of the dark lady of the sonnets referred to by Shakespeare, and other characters who are real. I say characters, but historical figures like Reasonable Black Man, the Silk Weaver of Southwark, and John Blank the Black, who was a master trumpeter for King Henry's VII and VIII. So I love the idea of telling the stories, and I work as a playwright poet. I work in characters. Do you do that? Lela, you obviously do that with regard to Islam, but I wondered, Olivia, if you do that in terms of stepping into character.
I do. I struggle, in a certain sense, academic writing can be creative, but in a certain sense, it seems quite different from the creative practice. And so, I'm in awe. One of my best friends in the world is a poet, the wonderful poet Amanda Gunn, and she has. I look at what she does, and I look at her magic, and I don't have the gift in a certain sense, but I can have the gift in my thinking. I don't have the gift in the writing. That my poetry is ugly. It's not like hers. It's not like yours. But the sense of thinking. Can I think about this character? Do I feel like a person's coming alive? Now that something happens in my heart there, and I can feel something that's very alive there, and there's where I think I get at least to taste some of the magic, even if I don't kind of produce the results, if you see what I mean.
Well, Olivia, if you want to come along to the workshop series that myself and Christella Littress, you will think very differently about your poetry, let me tell you, by the end. So on the 13th and 18th of June, we have poetry and music workshops taking place in the house. So we are working with people who are bringing themselves wherever they begin to the workshop.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'd absolutely love that. I recognize we've taken up a lot of your time this evening. Thank you both from the very bottom of my heart. It has been such an honor and a privilege to have this conversation with you this evening, to learn more about your work, to learn more about the wonderful ideas you're working with. Thank you so very much. I'll echo something that's just happened in our webinar chat is a reminder about the exhibition, to come see and interact with the exhibition, to learn more about both of your work, to see this on display, to see the portrait from Lela when it goes on display, to see Rommi Smith, your work, your poetry is actually readable as part of the exhibition, which I absolutely love. It's called Austen and Turner, a country house encounter. It's a landmark exhibition on Austen and Turner at Harewood House, West Yorkshire, and it's co-curated by the University of York Centre for 18th Century Studies. So come and see it. Come take a look. If you're curious, you're going to love it. I've seen it, and it's gorgeous, and it's such a live exhibition. It's wonderful. Thank you, Rommi. Thank you, Lela, so very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Thank you, Lela. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you so much, everybody. Good night.